We're going to read in the Torah portion, the parasha this week, Parashas Kisavoy, about what's called Bikkurim. And Bikkurim means that once the Jewish people were in the land of Israel and they had settled the land, and that's quite important, Rashi makes that point right at the beginning, that this particular mitzvah is unique in that it could only be performed only after the Jews had completely settled the entire land of Israel. So when that happens, there's this mitzvah called Bikkurim, which means that if you're a farmer, whatever the first produce is from the yield of that particular year, you take the first produce up to the Beis Hamikdash as a donation. Now, it's a beautiful thing, and we're familiar with it. I don't know if you've ever read, but the Gemara describes how it was when people would bring their Bikkurim. It was this massive celebration, and people would stream from all different directions and join together, and they'd play music, and they would adorn the oxen that they used to pull the carts that had all these Bikkurim there with all kinds of adornments. It was a very beautiful experience. What's interesting, though, is that if you brought Bikkurim, you had to make a verbal declaration. And the Torah tells us what the verbal declaration was that a person had to make. The declaration was a declaration of gratitude. And it basically said, thank God that we now live where we live. Right? We now live in Israel, in this promised land. It's like a beautiful thing. But part of the declaration also was, and we paraphrase part of the declaration in our reading at the Pesach Seder. Part of the declaration was to say that years ago, generations ago, Arami Oived Avi, there was a person called Lavan who was an Aramean, and he was the father-in-law of our forefather Yaakov, and he wanted to eradicate Yaakov. He had this malevolent intention to destroy Yaakov. And thank God Hashem saved us. And then this next declaration that you make is that we went down to Egypt and we were slaves in Egypt. And then Hashem took us out of Egypt with this great and mighty hand, as the expression goes. Yad HaChazaka, the great and mighty hand. So what's interesting about this is, obviously it's a declaration of gratitude, and goes without saying, because here you are, you're bringing your produce, and you're saying, thank God I have this beautiful portion of land, and thank God it has yielded. And while you're about it, it kind of makes sense that you should include other areas or incidents in history where we should be grateful towards Hashem. The only question is, out of all of the things that had happened in Jewish history, how come only two of them are included in this declaration? And out of the two, you could definitely understand why you thank Hashem for the exodus from Egypt, because we know that that's a pivotal moment in our nation's history. And we know that getting out of Egypt birthed us as a people, as the prophet Yechezkel says. And as a direct result of getting out of Egypt, we were able to get the Torah, and then we were able to get to the promised land. So if the exodus from Egypt had never happened, we understand there'd be no Judaism really to speak of, so you can appreciate why there's gratitude for that. But the story of Lavan, who attacked Yaakov, even though he didn't actually attack him, you read the history, he schemed against Yaakov, and his schemes failed multiple times. First he schemed in terms of who he was going to give as a daughter in marriage, and then he schemed against him financially, and then he schemed against him to try and take his grandchildren back when Yaakov eventually left, and each time he failed. So it doesn't seem like one of those incidents that is so overwhelming that it deserves attention. If we're going to give gratitude to Hashem, we could compile a list from early Jewish history of incidents that deserve gratitude. For example, if you're worried about Lavan threatening Yaakov, then surely we should give gratitude to Hashem that he saved Yaakov from Esav, who also threatened him, and maybe even a little bit more overtly. When you read the story of Lavan, you don't actually hear in the story that Lavan tried to destroy Yaakov physically. He just tried to ruin him financially, and he tried to interfere with his spirituality. Whereas Esav, we know, came, firstly he wanted to kill Yaakov to the extent that Yaakov had to run away. And then when he came back to reunite, we know that Esav came with 400 men armed to the teeth. So surely, if we're giving gratitude to Hashem for the various times that Hashem saved us, that should be on the list. Likewise, as soon as the Jews left Egypt, they were attacked by the nation of Amalek, and Amalek was a frightening nation and a powerful nation. The fact that we were able not only to escape their clutches, but to vanquish the army at the time was a miracle. We should thank Hashem for that. Or how about the fact that as the Jews drew closer to the land of Israel, They fought against the mighty kingdoms of Sichon and Og, who Rashi says were not only mighty people, but they had mighty armies. It was a huge miracle that we were able to overwhelm them. So surely we should give gratitude for that, or for escaping the curses of Bilam. Or, how about this? Who says you only have to give gratitude to Hashem for having saved your skin? There are other things to give gratitude for as well. For 40 years, the Jews lived in the desert, and they were protected miraculously by the clouds that surrounded them, because you can imagine the desert was exposed to snakes and scorpions and terrible climate, and probably all bands of marauding thieves and who knows what. So they were protected by the clouds. In addition to which, they had these daily miracles of the manna that came to them and the water of Miriam's well. It's quite a thing. So how come it is that we ignore all of those things and we just give gratitude to Hashem for two things? Saving Yaakov from Lavan and saving us from Egypt. And the Rebbe explains, it's a lengthy explanation, but we'll cut to the chase. The Rebbe explains that the nature of the declaration we made when bringing Bikkurim back in those days was not only thank you for the produce. It was primarily, and that's why Rashi insists that this mitzvah only applies once they had settled the land, because it's primarily gratitude for our home. Thank God we have this home called Israel. And that's why you brought Bikkurim specifically out of those species of produce that are considered the great 7 species of Israel, because it's gratitude for our home. Now, whenever you want to highlight something, what you do is you contrast it with its opposite. So this home that we live in, this was the declaration, this home that we live in is a home of brocha. It's a home of abundance. It's a home of spirituality. It's a home where everything is great. Previously in our nation's history, we had occasion to live in other homes, and those homes were inhospitable. So when Yaakov lived for 20 years in Lavan's home, that was his home. That was his place. That was his root. That was his foundation at that time. And it was a horrible place to live, because he lived with people who wanted to uproot him and undermine him and overthrow him. Likewise, when the Jews were in Egypt, that was our home for 200 odd years. And it was a terrible home to live in, because the people there enslaved us and they killed our children, and it was horrible. The desert was never our home. The desert was a transit. It just so happens that we messed up along the way, so we ended up having a delayed transit. But it was literally like being in a transit lounge and your flight's been delayed for 40 years. But it was never our home. So it doesn't fit the theme of what the person would declare and what they would give thanks for at the time that they brought their Bikkurim. And it's quite a magnificent thing, because that tells you something. It actually teaches you quite an amazing lesson about acknowledging brocha and about giving gratitude, that ultimately the goal is not just to give a willy-nilly kind of gratitude. Okay, thank you Hashem for everything. Sometimes people do that. Oh, thank you. I love my life. Thank you Hashem for everything. An appropriate way to give gratitude is to be specific and to be contextual and say, right now I have this brocha in my life. Not only should I just say, thank you for what I have, but it is appropriate to contrast it against perhaps a time in my life when I didn't have it. To acknowledge that I haven't always been on the top of the crest of the wave. I've had my options to be in the doldrums as well. And so I'm especially grateful to Hashem for being in this particular place. There's a deeper spiritual lesson as well. And the deeper spiritual lesson is that very often when people try to connect themselves to Hashem and they want to have a relationship and they want to be spiritual, people forget about the place, the environment in which they live. In other words, they think my relationship with Hashem is what goes on within my head and within my heart. So if I feel inspired, or if I feel love towards Hashem, or if I'm intellectually stimulated by Torah, or whatever the case is, that's great, that's wonderful. I now have a meaningful connection to Hashem. The nature of Bikkurim is to remind us that all of your experience of your relationship with Hashem needs to have some kind of real influence on the world in which you live. So here you are, you're bringing this donation to Hashem, and while you bring the donation to Hashem, you acknowledge the fact that where I live is a place of goodness. In other words, my environment should be touched by my relationship with Hashem. It should never just be about how much I learn and how much I meditate, or how much I daven, or how spiritual I feel. It should always be about how much greatness and light do I bring around me because of what I've learned and because of how I've davened. And that's why, specifically at this point in time, the gratitude is associated with where I live, to teach me that the bracha I have personally, spiritually, needs to wash over into where I live as well. I think it's a beautiful lesson.